Thank you for tuning in to Planting Seeds, Philanthropy in Saskatchewan, a podcast where we aim to connect you to the community impact that is empowered by donors and charities across the prairies. I'm your host, Victor Roman, from the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. I hope you enjoyed the listen. We'd like to welcome Nick Crighton today to the podcast. We actually have a bit of a special episode today, with it being September and September being a more prominent month around Truth and Reconciliation. We wanted to use this episode to highlight Truth and Reconciliation in our community, as well as SSCF's commitment to Truth and Reconciliation. So I'm very lucky today to have our guest, Nick Crighton. Nick is the Executive Director at Indigenous Manufacturing and Contracting Network and was previously the Director of Indigenous Engagement at the Saskatchewan Chamber of Commerce. Nick has been involved as a cultural advisor in some way, shape, and form for various organizations for more than a decade now. This includes time with the University of Regina, K+S Potash, City of Regina, and Indigenous Services Canada, just to name a few. On top of all that, he's also a very busy and dedicated volunteer, having spent time with organizations such as the Newo Yotina Friendship Centre, Regina Aboriginal Professionals Association, Reconciliation Regina, and most recently, he actually joined us at SSCF on our Truth and Reconciliation Fund committee. So we'll be talking a bit more about that as we go forward. But first off, welcome, Nick. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me, Victor. That was a nice little intro there. Somebody reading off some of my resume for me.
Yeah, a long list there to get through, for sure. So as I kind of mentioned, we want to talk Truth and Reconciliation today, but before I get too far into it and we really go off, I just wanted to let the listeners know a little bit about SSCF's very short history with Truth and Reconciliation. Well, short history being active with it, I suppose. So SSCF's roots in Truth and Reconciliation really began back in 2017. One of the things we do is we were hosting things called the Vital Community Conversations, where we kind of hear about the emergent needs and the things happening in communities. And there was one back in 2017 titled Pursuing Reconciliation, a Community Forum. It was a way to engage participants in an opportunity to share knowledge and stories about the importance of reconciliation. And at that time, it's kind of when the conversation of reconciliation, I think, was becoming more new, kind of becoming more of that buzzword at the time that we're hoping that it doesn't just stay as a buzzword. It's something we can make last forever. But, you know, effort takes time. and even though that was back in 2017, we've been making kind of baby steps along the way. And finally, in August 2021, SSCF was able to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Fund. And this fund's purpose is to provide financial support and to fund activities that support Indigenous community in the advancement of reconciliation and the calls to action within our region here in South Saskatchewan. So we can talk a little bit more about the purpose of the fund, but very generally, it's looking to address areas regarding education, culture, and language. And for the first year of the fund, SSCF is matching donations up to $300,000 to go towards the fund to grow the fund. So if anybody listening wants to learn more, we'll have information on our website at sscf.ca/reconciliation. Again, that's sscf.ca/reconciliation. And if you go there, you can learn more about the fund. You can see how to donate. You can also see details regarding applying for a grant to actually get funding from the fund as a charity. So that's just a very high level what SSCF is up to. Part of that fund is that we do have a committee that oversees it to ensure that the funds are being used in an appropriate way. Nick here is actually, as I mentioned before, he's on that committee. So we thought it would be great to have him on and just talk a little bit about his experiences, as well as help give us some updates on what the committee is up to. So with all that said, let's kind of back it up here and let's just focus on just the topic of Truth and Reconciliation itself. So I know one of the things I asked you before this, Nick, was just to talk a bit about, what is Truth and Reconciliation? kind of as a whole from your perspective, which I know can be a big question, but I like to ask that big question and see what it means to yourself.
Well, yeah, no, though it's definitely a big question, and it can be answered in so many ways. But ultimately, what I see truth and reconciliation is it's a personal journey for everybody. I mean, we can go into, there's 94 calls to action from Truth and Reconciliation. There's the over 200 calls to justice that was out there. There was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. So a lot of times, before I talk about what me personally, what a lot of times people ask me, what is Truth and Reconciliation? There's already been subject matter experts like Indigenous scholars, people, grassroots people, matriarchs out there that have put together actionable things that you can do either as an individual, as a family, as a community, as an organization, all of those kinds of stuff. So, but personally, how I see truth and reconciliation is honoring our survivors of the residential schools. That's the reality. Is I truly believe that the reality is that it was a government designed, residential schools were a government designed they were government designed to assimilate Indigenous children, right? And then to put them more in the dominant society, but essentially just to the quote that they use is to kill the Indian in the child, right? And because of the intergenerational impacts of residential schools, you can see what that's led to, and that's led to a lot of socioeconomic problems that we've been dealing with and trying to figure out for a very long time. But ultimately, from my perspective, it's a personal journey. Some people are quick to rush to reconciliation, Vic, and they are quick to rush to reconciliation without acknowledging the truth. And I think people have to understand that each individual person is on their own truth and reconciliation journey, right? And some people might still just be at that truth phase and uncovering that and figuring out what that means to them personally and how they can take action and be a strong ally and do stuff to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard and that there's more Indigenous perspectives brought to that table. So I think the big thing is what I would say is listening, but understanding that it's a personal journey for everybody. Truth and reconciliation can be done by absolutely everyone. It's everyone's responsibility. It's your community's responsibility to take that upon themselves and really take a look at how they can go about making change or choosing some actionable things to become an ally, whatever that looks like for them. So. Yeah, no, I mean, you're going to have to cut me off, but ultimately it really means taking a look at those actions and seeing what you can do. But I really believe it starts at the kitchen table. Mm-hmm. You know, things that you and I were taught maybe in school and elementary, high school, whatever the case was, we didn't necessarily learn about residential schools. I certainly didn't learn it in my Native Studies class. You know, I was learning about the fur trade or stuff like that, which is an important part of our history. But even that, you know, didn't tell a fulsome picture of what actually happened. And so that's what I think is learn the history of the land that you're on, take time to understand. And then there's a difference between even understanding that term indigenization and decolonization. That's another term that comes out quite often, is that anybody can decolonize. That's for absolutely everyone. But when it comes to indigenization, that should be left for the Indigenous subject matter experts. So anyways, I feel like hopefully I answered that, but
yeah. No, you did. And one of the things that you really talked about there at the beginning of, I think, the importance of education and understanding. And like you said, what we learned in school, or to be honest, I think a lot of it, especially for the majority of our province, I would say what we did not learn in school is very prominent. Because I know for me, like, I'm 35, so I would have been in high school in the mid 2000s. When I was in I think it was grade 11 or grade 12 was the first year that Native Studies was even offered as an elective at my school. And there was a lot of information there that, like, in hindsight should really just be built into Canadian social studies for one. But even within that Native studies lens, like, yeah, we were learning about the treaties, we were learning about the fur trade, like you said, but we weren't learning about the truth of the conditions that people were necessarily put in. You kind of get like a glimpse of it, but you definitely were being told like the colonial history of it, and you didn't get the Indigenous perspective in any way, shape, or form. We didn't learn about Indigenous culture. There was very few things. Like, you learn about a teepee essentially, but you don't really understand anything behind that at the time. And I know that our education system has expanded since then. I don't know what it looks like, but my assumption is that it probably still has a lot of expanding to do. But there is a reality that, like, including me, like anybody kind of my age, and the older you get and the older you get, the less exposure you would have had to any information regarding this. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done for non-Indigenous people in order to understand that truth, as you said. And if you don't understand that truth, then what are you reconciling? You don't know. And that's one of the things that I thought was really interesting when our committee met about the Truth and Reconciliation Fund, was the education aspect. And it was very clear that the education aspect, in a lot of ways, is focused towards non-Indigenous people to understand the context and the history and the present of what's happening in order to really have a meaningful relationship to go towards knowing what am I to reconcile, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Us being the same age, Vic, there was an option to take either in school, right? Just talking strictly on education, you can take history or Native studies, which thinking about it, you're like, those shouldn't be separate. No. They should be told, and they should also be taken a look at from an Indigenous lens. Often history is told from one point of view, and it needs to be multiple points of view when it comes to our curriculum, because ultimately our curriculum is shaping our young people, right? And so they need to have access to that information. And not only that, our school divisions, right? I think it was 2007, it became mandatory in our province, in our provincial curriculum, to teach treaties in the classroom. And so the government of Saskatchewan and the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, they partnered together and they created a treaty kit. And it was this train the trainer program. So you can have these educational resources, lesson plans, CDs, DVDs, everything from K to 12 was created. And at that time, school divisions, they had the funding from the Office of the Treaty Commissioner and the government to put together these large boxes. And so multiple schools and school divisions had access to these treaty kits. But then it just comes down to school boards, school divisions, teachers, all of them buying into that, right? And I think that's another thing, is that there was a real fear. I remember taking that training back in 2007, and I was sitting in a room full of teachers, right? And some of them were excited to learn more. Others, you can tell that maybe if they were 20-year teachers, that they didn't want to have to learn something new, or didn't feel like that was something that they needed to incorporate, right? And so the reality I like to tell teachers quite often, right, is if you're teaching about the Amazon and the Brazilian rainforest, you don't need to bring in somebody from Brazil, right? If you're teaching the treaties, understanding that there was two parties, well, there's a third, which is the Great Spirit, the Creator, but there's two parties that signed, right? And so teaching the treaties, you're not going to be disrespectful. You're just laying out the facts. And that's when it comes to teaching history, that can be done by non-Indigenous people as well. When it comes to talking about ceremonies and traditions and culture, that's when you can bring in an Indigenous subject matter expert or an elder, a knowledge keeper, a traditional advisor, or what have you. But when it comes to introducing treaties into the classroom or talking about residential schools, that can be done by anybody. Because it's out there, it happened, right? It should be incorporated into our classrooms in a very big way. But not only that piece of it, but even talking about Indigenous ingenuity, they can be incorporated into math, can be incorporated into our sciences, can be incorporated into multiple subjects, and talk about the celebration of Indigenous people and our inventions, and how long we've been able to live and survive off the land, right? And so I digress here, Victor, but those are some of the challenges, right? Is really taking a look at what does our education system look like, and how open is our school divisions and our school boards across not only Saskatchewan but across Canada on what are they doing to ensure that these are becoming mandatory to be taught. And that means that teachers maybe you're going to have to cut out some of the curriculum that maybe is antiquated or a little outdated, right? Taking something, nothing against William Shakespeare, but putting somebody learning about, Hamlet or something, or maybe there could be some things in there that don't necessarily need to be incorporated and make room for the original people of this land, the Indigenous content from an Indigenous worldview. So, yeah.
No, I absolutely agree. And, being a non-Indigenous person myself, I guess, like you kind of, and just I've been involved with different charities and stuff. And I know one of the things that can be true is that, residential schools, for example, a very prime example, they're an uncomfortable conversation, right? There's nothing comfortable when you have to bring up the horrible atrocities that have been committed to kids and families being separated and culture being destroyed. So I think it's kind of a natural thing that's like, well, we don't want to talk about something that's going to make you feel bad. So then people don't know how to talk about it. Or if it comes up, it's kind of a default to, you might have anxiety, you might have fear, and might want to close it down. And all I'd really say is I think that's why that education and that education starting young is very important. So it's just always a part of it. And I think there's what I would say, at least to non-Indigenous people listening, anyone listening, but what I found, at least in my experience and people around me, is that you can acknowledge that something was terrible, but focus on a solution. And if you're solution focused and you're thinking about how to make something positive, you're going to have way more of an impact in the long run, as well as taking care of your own kind of mental state. It's a way to almost trick your brain into being like, well, let's talk about something horrible because now we're going to do something good about it. We're not going to let it ever go back to that. We're going to take the steps we need to not repeat history and make a better future. That sort of aspect. And where I want to go with that is, I just have a question. I have no idea what your answer is to it, but you've been involved in organizations in some way, shape, or form for over a decade now. Truth and Reconciliation has been a conversation for a few years, but it's been a reality for much longer than that conversation. And I'm just wondering, within that kind of 10-year span or that over a decade span, how much have you seen the needle be pushed regarding kind of the truth side and the reconciliation side? And how much further do you think we have to go?
I think we still have a very long ways to go, Victor. I think it's great with our access to information and being able to share and upload, and somebody can turn their phone on and start recording, or that education is starting to come out a lot more. The unfortunate reality, Victor, is that unfortunately, they had to do that discovery, in late May of last year at Kamloops Indian Residential School. And then it kind of led a wave across our country, but not only our country, but internationally as well. People started to realize and started asking, when I graduated high school, and I went outside, there was never a cemetery. But that was unfortunate. That's the unfortunate reality of over 130 residential schools across federally run residential schools across Canada. So I think people are aware of it. They just may not know how to take actionable steps, right? And now that we have this National Day of Reconciliation, which started off originally as Orange Shirt Day, which originated from the story of Phyllis Webstad from BC. And the story of her little shirt, getting ripped off on her first day from residential school, bought from her grandmother, all of those kinds of things. And that's where that Orange Shirt Day originated. There's tons of stories like that, like Phyllis's and others. I think that we have to be careful on performative truth and reconciliation, where it's not if you've taken the Indigenous awareness training, if you've taken anti-racism training, if you've done other things out there to help educate you, that's excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's really taking a look on the inside of your organization and saying, now that I have this knowledge, what am I doing to make my organization more inclusive? How am I putting pen to paper? How am I really auditing and taking a look at these policies to ensuring that they are going to be inclusive of that Indigenous community in a very, very real way, right? So participating in Orange Shirt Day with your organization, that's excellent. It's a good way to get that message out there. Even doing things like land acknowledgements, those can be good, but they also have to come along with more action as well, right? Those, and some people might feel differently on that and in a different way, but they have to come with some genuine action as well, not just saying I'm doing a land acknowledgement, whatever the case may be. There has to be more to it than that, and there has to be more inclusivity, and there also needs to be more Indigenous people sitting around the table making these kinds of decisions, right? For far too long, Victor, Indigenous people historically have been told, this is what we think is best for you, and so this is what we're going to do. And not only do we think that it's best for you, but we're also going to create laws that prevent you from doing anything else. And so that's and that's just the reality that Indigenous people have been facing in our history. And just we talked about what you're going back to, right? Is like, it's okay to talk about the past, so we ensure that we don't make mistakes for the future, right? We have to learn from that, and we have to be a better generation for your children, for my children, because they're starting to learn and talk about these things at the kitchen table. So, yes, I think there's awareness, but I think still more education as a society needs to happen, whether that be a communication, more billboards, more did you know facts, maybe more incorporated in mainstream media in so many ways, right? And so, yeah, there's still a lot to do when it comes to, and if you're taking a look at something, something that I'm passionate about is diversifying your supply chain. What does your procurement program look like? How inclusive is it? What does your hiring practice look like? What does your HR practices look like? Do you have Indigenous people sitting around your executive tables, your manager tables? Do you have them, are there succession plans to ensure that maybe you have a frontline staff that's Indigenous or self-identifies Indigenous? Is there not possibility to get them moved up into your organization, right, to be decision makers? So yeah, like I said, there's awareness, but there's always room for improvement, and there's always ways to challenge ourselves. And just what you had said is people have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And it's something I've said before, and I've heard many times, is that, as somebody who is Indigenous, I'm First Nations. And when I tell a quick story, Victor, when I walked into my very first year university, I came from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, but I'm originally from Waterhen Lake. And that's a smaller town. It's like 5,000, but I saw Regina, Saskatoon as the big city, right? So going into university, I walked into my first Psych 100 class, and it was in the education auditorium at the U of R. And when I walked in, I was terrified. I was nervous. I was like, this is crazy how many people are in this class right now. And I literally just scanned the room, and I was like looking for another brown face. Yeah. And I was looking. I was like, oh, there's a brown. I was like, oh, that's a different brown. And then I found another First Nations person, and I felt comfortable, so I went and sat by them. But that is just one story among so many common stories. Even being in a boardroom or sitting around a table, in a workplace or being wherever you work, quite often, our generation, and even younger and even older than my generation, have been the only Indigenous people sitting around that room. So that then makes them, all of a sudden, they're the Indigenous expert, which is, it's not fair to put that kind of pressure on Indigenous people, right? But so there's work to do. It's great that people are aware of it. It's great that the federal government has come along and made it a stat holiday. but a lot of work needs to get done in terms of educating our society as a whole.
Mm-hmm. I think what I would maybe even say, because with all that, like you mentioned, the stat holiday, the treaty or the land acknowledgements, things like that, is like, I think an important way to look at it is these are all tiny little elements of a big picture, and they mean absolutely nothing on their own. If all you do is a land acknowledgement, you haven't really participated. If all you do is take a day off work, even if you take that day off work and you celebrate and go to like a round dance for the first time, that's one step, but you can't stop there. It's really, and that's one of the things that is really on my mind a lot is, we're at the beginning stages. We've been thinking about this publicly across Canada, really only for a few years, about something that's existed for hundreds of years. So the idea that I think people need to be comfortable knowing that, we're a few years in of something that's going to take hundreds of years to stop even thinking about. And the reality is it's something that should last forever. This land is going to be shared forever, ideally, as long as we take care of it,
Yes.
So I think that's one important thing for people to remember, is that we can't just kind of say, okay, like, even I know we've talked about it with this fund with SSCF, this is a starting point. If we want to be successful 10 years from now, we can't just say, okay, well, we did this back in 2021, 2022, and kind of wipe our hands clean. It doesn't work like that, right? So I think that's one of the things that's really important is, SSCF, we hold funds in perpetuity. Truth and reconciliation is something that's going to happen in perpetuity as well.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that's important. And understanding that journey, whenever you decide to start, understanding that it's important for that individual journey of yourself. And it doesn't have to be, and the goal behind starting that truth and reconciliation journey or decolonization or taking those actionable steps, you don't need to tell anybody about it. It doesn't have to be performative. You just got to do it for yourself, your family, do it for your community, do it for your organization. And sometimes you're going to have to get, like I said, comfortable being uncomfortable, putting yourself in those situations, because that's where real change starts to happen, right? If you want to build relationships with the Indigenous community, go to their annual events, go to their celebrations, learn about the culture, learn about the land that you live on, learn about the original people, learn about the treaty relationship that Canada holds with our First Nations people. So it's important that we are aware of those things. We need to know those things, right? I mean, these are things that are taught. These are mandatorily taught. Like, for example, the teaching about World War II and the role Germany played is mandatory in elementary and like elementary school and secondary school and all of that. So they know about their history and understand that they weren't the perpetrators, right? But they have that knowledge, so they know that they don't need to make those same mistakes again. And that's how I feel about our education system as well, there's the sense sometimes that people feel guilty, Victor. They feel like, oh my God, I had no idea. And, I'm 60 years old and I had no idea of this knowledge. Now, Indigenous people don't want to hear those excuses, not because, we all weren't taught this in our schools. And it didn't affect you in your own personal life. So of course you're not aware of that. But the excuse part is now there isn't one. Now there's an actual day off, a stat holiday for you to learn on how you can honor Indigenous people and their voices, and really learning from Indigenous artists, learning from Indigenous scholars, learning from grassroots organizers and volunteers, advocates, water protectors, people that are in different parts of different pieces of the different positions in industry, even elected officials, whatever the case may be, learn from that Indigenous perspective. And I think that's definitely going to go a long way, because it's definitely time. It's time that our story get told in a way from our Indigenous viewpoint. So,
absolutely. One of the things I want to start to kind of shift the focus a little bit more to, I guess, not just SSCF's fund, but I want to talk a bit about the role of philanthropy and donors and what really funding truth and reconciliation can look like for any listener that might be looking to, I want to participate. It's one thing to volunteer. It's extremely important, I think, to volunteer and to help out. But the reality we live in is that, things cost money and reparations cost money too. And there's so many just amazing Indigenous organizations helping restore culture, just helping Indigenous people in need, things like that. Like there's countless that we see come through SSCF. But one of the things that I want to talk to you about, I guess, is like, what does the role of money and giving money play in truth and reconciliation?
Well, I think a large part of the things that we can do is if you're deciding that want to start donating to these funds, really do the work to see what are these organizations and who are they serving? Because quite often we talk about, okay, well, I would like to do something and I have this large pot of money. It's now just taking a really hard look at, okay, where is this money going? Is it going to individual wealth or is it going to community wealth? And we want to be able to disseminate that and have a really good idea on where this fund is going, whether it's going to support youth programming, it's going to support language and culture, it's going to support recreation and sports, it's going to support education, or it's going to support, employment, whatever that looks like. But ultimately, understanding that, and it's what I had said before, Victor, allowing these individual communities to tell you what their priorities are, because there's going to be a difference between First Nation A versus First Nation B versus First Nation C versus Métis Community B. All of these different things, they know what their priorities are, right? And so the question we have to start doing is just asking, where do you guys need this? Where are your guys's, what is going to make the largest impact in your community? And how can we go about funding that in a way that's going to be supportive? Because we do already have subject matter experts. We have people there that know what the community priorities are and know where we need to get focused to bring us back up to the same level as everybody else, and removing those barriers, right? And understanding that those barriers are in place, right? And then ultimately, when you're looking at donating money, taking the time to reject racism, taking the time to audit those organizations in a very real way, to say, and hopefully they can identify if that money, those funds are going to the community and are getting in the right hands of the right people in those communities, and they're going towards the programming that they need, right? And instead of saying, you know what, we have this large check, we're just going to donate it to, the Truth and Reconciliation Fund. We're going to donate it to so and so. Learn about what that is. What does that mean? Who is it? Where is that money going? Have an idea of where that is, and if it's is it going into create personal wealth, or is it actually going into contributing to the community in a positive way? So I think that's where philanthropy can definitely help in that sense. And even if you're accepting money, let's say you're accepting money, right? Really taking a look at, does this organization, is there any focus on truth and reconciliation? Is there programming serving the needs of Indigenous people? Is it inclusive? Are they telling a story that includes the Indigenous perspective? What does that look like? And I think that's a huge part of it is being inclusive, and then also allowing that same level of participation from the Indigenous voices. So I hope that helps answer that question, Victor.
Yeah, it does. And it kind of reflects a bit on one of our earlier episodes. We talked to Melissa Coomber-Benson, the CEO at the YWCA Regina. And one of the things she mentioned about donors is that she doesn't want, signing a check is one thing, but really, if you're willing to donate to an organization or to a cause, invest yourself in it, learn about it, become an advocate about it, become a supporter, become something that when people stop you on the street to talk to you about, you not only kind of have a good understanding of what to say, but you really believe in it, because that's going to make more meaning to yourself in a selfish way, but it's going to help you make those decisions going forward. And then from the organization standpoint, I know the word that she uses, and it's something that I try to use in kind of everyday life, is that idea. Instead of, if someone does come to you and like you said, it's like, well, this organization seems to have like absolutely nothing regarding like an Indigenous focus or understanding. And one of the things that she would say, like from the women's side, is instead of calling them out, call them in, invite them in to learn, identify that, but in a way where it's like, we want to welcome you in. If you are going to make this commitment, this is what we want from you as well. And create the ally that way as well. Opposed to hopefully just shutting someone off too. So I really liked that from her. And it's one of the things, kind of a tangent, but I think it's applicable to anybody in any day life as well as charities, is that, you know, it's easy to see someone doing something wrong and say, you're doing something wrong. And like social media is a good example. It's like the comment section, if someone doesn't like it, can just be wild. And
yes, it can be.
It's a lot more, it's more work, it's more effort, but it's something that might get somewhere. If someone sees that people are just angry at them, they're going to shut down. But if someone can see someone say, hey, this wasn't the right approach, but come here, I'm willing to welcome you in, let's walk through this, there's more of a chance that they're going to feel comfortable reassessing what just happened, or reassessing the things they're doing that maybe aren't aligned with what a charitable cause is. So I think that's one thing that a donor can keep in mind too, is, you know, if you hear that and you say like, oh, well, we don't do anything, so I don't know if we're in a position to donate. It's like, no, reach out and do both at once. Like learn and donate if you can, you know, it's all encompassing.
You are absolutely right. And don't be afraid, and don't take it personally if the door gets shut in your face. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that sometimes what people do is they, especially on the organizational side, quite often I'll hear, you know, and I've been very fortunate, Victor, to do, you know, Indigenous awareness trainings now for 15 years of my career, and almost in almost every job that I've had, in the private, nonprofit, and public sector. And without fail, somebody comes up to me after the training and they say something like, oh, you know, we reached out to this First Nation, or we reached out to this Métis local or community, and we didn't have a good experience. And that was like 3 or 4 years ago. Right. And so that then sets the tone for how they're going to move forward. And for me, I'm like, don't take that stuff personal, because of the history Indigenous people have with industry reaching out, with government reaching out, and them not keeping their promises. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's not just a phone call. It's actually going out to these events. It's going out to meet people. It's going out to listen to the people that live there and hear their stories.
Yeah.
And then also go ahead.
I was going to say, you've got to convince the people you're talking to that you're there for the right reason. So that one phone call isn't enough. Yeah.
Yeah, it's genuine, right? And when you start showing up, the people will start to see that you're genuine. And if you show up more than once and you're out there, people are going to start to accept that you want to make that change, not only in your personal life, but organizationally, right? And making that effort is huge when it comes to relationship building, right? Like if you see it as a relationship that you have with your partner, or if you have a partner or with a friend or a family member, if you just check on them once a year, or how good is that relationship going to be? You know what I mean? You really have to take time to invest in that relationship and invest in a good way, in a way that's not performative. That's not just there to say, oh, hey, I put my orange shirt on and then to take this picture with my coworkers, and then 5 minutes later you pull it off, and you take that shirt off and you decide to go on about your day. What actual work are you doing, and where are you taking to learn? Where are you going to learn from it? But I wanted to get back to that piece really quick there, Victor. Sorry, on not being afraid to put yourself in those situations, but also understand that we have to be careful, because we're talking about inviting people in, because you're right, calling people out, it's very easy to do. You're going to have to, people have to take that individual journey up to them. It's up to them to definitely try not to rely too heavily on Indigenous people doing that work for you, because it could be re-traumatizing for somebody, right? And saying, oh, why don't you go and teach me about this? You can learn about the treaties online. You can learn about how to decolonize. You can Google right now ways to be an ally, and ways to be an ally to the Indigenous community, ways to be an ally to the BIPOC community, ways to be an ally to any community that can be identified out there. And there is a lot of good information. So it's going to take a little bit of work. And you have to be ready for that kind of work. You have to be committed to doing that kind of work. So hopefully that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. And yeah, I think the trauma, I mean, beyond just the amount of work involved, the trauma side of it is something too that sometimes I think can be hard to understand. I just want to give my own little anecdotal story. My father's someone who suffered a lot of trauma in South America, which brought him to Canada. When I was like 20, I asked him to tell his story in front of a class at university. He did it, but he wasn't comfortable. And I realized after, especially years in the future, it actually took him 45 years to ever tell his family what happened to him, because that's how long it took him to come to terms to just tell that story comfortably. So when you say that, it's like you're asking someone to do it over and over again. Like I made that mistake with him younger. With this, when you're talking to someone that went through residential school, you can assume there's trauma. So if you want to bring up a topic like that, you're bringing up a traumatic topic that might be traumatic for the person you're talking to. So yeah, I hear you there. Trying not to bring up those triggers when unnecessary is really important, just to being kind of having a very basic trauma informed approach.
Of course, Victor. And another piece to that is that ensuring that if you are going to be putting on a community event, so for example, this made me think of a few years ago, I worked at the city of Regina, and at the Newo Yotina Centre, we held a free movie night for the community, and it was on truth and reconciliation, but it was called Indian Horse, right? It's that book by Richard Wagames, and then turned into a full feature film. We understood as Indigenous people that watching that show, and it's about residential schools, can be re-traumatizing for our knowledge keepers, our former residential schools, our residential school survivors. And so we ensured that we had a psychologist in place, an Indigenous psychologist in place, a place where people can go and smudge, because these can definitely lead to feelings of sadness, right? And we don't want to necessarily re-traumatize people and have them retell their stories, because they may have already dealt with it, right? They may have already put it behind them. They compartmentalized it and they've put it away and they've been okay with it, right? And so I think asking those questions too is very important. And I think, it's your dad, but be gentle on yourself. You're 20 years old, so it's hard to know. You know it was a good story. But thinking about that, we didn't necessarily have that language back then. You know what I mean? And I think that's a huge part of it. Another side story too. I worked at the Ranchero Society, and for the summer, they go on summer camp trips, and these youth, these at-risk youth that are part of the Ranchero Society, I set up a sweat with my mushroom in Waterhen, because they were camping, I think, at Matheson Lake in northern Saskatchewan. Anyways, one of the days we went on, did a sweat, and I think it was like 23, 24 years old. And after the sweat, my mushroom started telling stories about residential schools, things that I never heard in my life growing up. But he was, in his mid 70s, and it took him that long, to feel confident and feel okay enough to start sharing his story, or some of those bits and pieces of his story. And so I was definitely grateful for being able to witness and listen to some of the things that he had to say. So there's a lot that's out there, and there's a lot that needs to be considered, and people need to, be aware of that. And if you don't know, it's okay to ask. It's definitely okay to ask, right? They teach us that in school, to put your hand up if you have a question. It should be the exact same way. So
yeah, anyways. Absolutely. I want to wrap us up here pretty soon. I mean, I don't want to. I want this to go on for a long time, but I'm going to get kicked out of this room in about 15 minutes. So I thought,
no, that's all right.
Maybe let's wrap this up a little bit about talking, just a tiny bit about, I mentioned SSCF's Truth and Reconciliation Fund. Mm-hmm. And we talked a lot about, there's the 3 pillars: education, culture, and language. I feel like we talked a lot about the education side, and I think that's super important. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we were discussing as a committee on the culture and language side. What's the importance towards, I guess, restoring culture and specifically restoring language, and why, I guess, as pillars of the fund, like, what do you see that doing for the community in the future going forward? The more that language is restored, the more that culture is restored.
So it's a very good question. Everyone, if you talk to our knowledge keepers, our old ones, our Kateyak, they're referred to as the old ones, they'll say that language is our culture. It's embedded in everything that we do. And that is the reality for our communities, right? Because of colonization, because of the Indian Act, because of residential schools, because of then moving on from residential schools, the group homes, all of that kind of stuff. These were all in phases. Language has been lost because we weren't allowed to speak, our ancestors weren't allowed to speak their language in residential schools. They had to learn brand new languages. And they were so young, right? That's the thing. I want to provide more context, but ultimately, when language is your culture, and if language starts to go away, and we don't have people speaking that language anymore, or practicing our ceremonies anymore, then our languages are going to become extinct, and then ultimately our culture and our traditions will start to become extinct, right? And so there needs to be encouragement that teaching Indigenous languages. I mean, in Canada, we mandatorily have to, our two languages in Canada are French and English, but having the opportunity or the option to teach multiple Indigenous languages, there's over 50 Indigenous languages across Canada. And so getting the opportunity for wherever territory you're in to be able to have access to that kind of education, to be able to learn that, I think is super powerful, and enabling communities to have that opportunity to learn from their old ones or their people that can speak the language or their fluent speakers, right? So whether that be offering free education for community, offering education right in your classroom specifically, hiring Indigenous language speakers to work right in your school systems, but not only in your primary and secondary schools, but even in your post-secondary, giving people that option to learn their language as adults, right? There's a lot of residential school survivors that have that story where they lost their language because they were punished for using their language. They were abused for using their language. And so now dealing with the fear of, the next time I use my language, that's automatically subconsciously triggering, oh man, I got abused because I did that. So when years go by, it's hard for them to want to be able to speak their language because there's tied to so much negativity, right? But there's always an opportunity to learn. I know like I was saying, residential school survivors that started learning their language at, when they're like in their mid 30s or in their late 40s or in their 50s, because they wanted to have ties to their communities. They wanted to have ties to their culture, but they're also taking a look at their own identity and seeing what that meant and how important it is. And language was embedded in everything that we do. It's embedded in our identity, and it's embedded in our practices. It's embedded in our traditions. It's embedded in our ceremonies. It's embedded in our celebrations, in our songs, our ceremonial songs, our celebration songs for like powwows, other things like that. And it's an important part of who we are as Indigenous people, as First Nations people, as Métis or Inuit people, is that as Inuit, we need to be able to have the room and opportunity to speak our language and not worry about it, right? And not worry that somebody could be potentially judging this. And I fast forward a bit here to, if you're let's say you're in sports. I'll use this analogy. And let's say you're a commentator in sports, right? Let's say you're commentating for NHL, right? There's a lot of Eastern European people that play in the NHL that have phonetically, it's really difficult to say their names. You know what I mean? Phonetically, it's really hard to say Nikolai Habibulin. It's not spelled that way. No. You have to find out how it's pronounced, right? A lot of people have fear on even saying the word in Regina, saying Mamawayatin, or saying words that are First Nations words, First Nations languages. Just taking the time to learn how to properly say it, right? That's putting in the effort, right? If commentators or other people out there, our radio hosts, our podcast hosts, are taking the time to learn how to correctly pronounce something from Eastern European languages or foreign languages from another country, from somebody's last name, well, we can definitely take the time to learn how to correctly pronounce the people that were the original inhabitants of this land. And it has to be a collective effort, not only from the Indigenous community, but from the non-Indigenous community as a whole as well, right? And I'm sure that you have some for yourself and your family, right? Language is so important to your community and your culture, and it's important that people understand that. So that's what I would say is language is your culture, and we don't want to lose that, and we want to try and provide as much opportunity to learn your language as you can, and even for young people, not being afraid to speak your language, even if you sound silly, right? Even if you have no experience speaking your language, you can always start somewhere. You can always start. There's so much resources that you can tap into to be able to communicate, and there's a lot of free resources, things that you may not necessarily need to pay for, right? You don't have to go out and buy Rosetta Stone to go out and learn your language. You can go on a little bit further. So that's an important piece. Is language is huge, and really taking a look at, is this going to be helping the community? Is this fund going to go towards supporting language and culture in a good way? And it should be celebrated when you're learning your language. And I think that's really important.
Yep. What I would even add, especially for non-Indigenous listeners, that might be just to give them a way to reflect on really language and culture in their own homes. One of the events here in Regina, it's one of the biggest ones in Saskatchewan, but we have Mosaic Festival, which usually happens every year, where we celebrate all the different cultures. We're a unique country in Canada. Everyone migrated here except for Indigenous people. So everybody has a background that's not, like, to be Canadian is to also have a background, no matter who you are. So, and we see that, you go to the Ukrainian pavilion, you enjoy amazing food, you see their dancing, you hear their music. Then you go to the Filipino pavilion, same thing. You taste different food. It's amazing. You hear different music. You hear a different language. And those pieces are important to everybody, and they really make up filling out who you are as a human and where you belong in society. In Canadian society, everybody has those too. Everybody's got a background from somewhere, so it shouldn't be foreign. I think if you're a listener, think of it from that lens too. Indigenous people are also trying to live in this Canada that was created on top of their land, and there's a culture there that if we lose that and it's gone, imagine what would happen to your own culture if it's gone. For me, Nick knows a bit about Chilean culture because he lives in a house with some Chilean people. I know for a fact. So, for me, it's empanadas. For someone else, it might be cabbage rolls. There's that food. There's that smell. There's those things that you're learning that really sort of give you purpose and pride too. Like when someone comes over to your house, what are the things that you're often proud to show them? It might be the food it's the recipe that's been passed down in your family for generations. That recipe is probably from a European country or an Asian country or a South American country. It's probably not a recipe that originated somewhere here in Canada. So I would say, think about that. Think about your own culture. If it was gone, what would happen? The answer is people would lose purpose. So when you look at least from my view, and you can correct me if you feel different, but when you look at the culture and language for Indigenous people, that's the purpose of Indigenous people. And if you don't have that, it's a lot harder to succeed. It's a lot harder to find ways to succeed within any society if you don't belong anywhere. And if where you belong has been destroyed, shut out, muted, not allowed. We've seen that happen for generations. And yeah, now we're just at the beginning point of restoring that.
You're 100% correct, Victor, in understanding that there's a lot of lost Indigenous people walking around, not understanding whether they've been 60 scoop survivors and they were taken away and adopted into other families, or sold off, or if they were former residential school survivors. Those generations last for a long time. And so there's a lot of people that are struggling with their identity. I mean, me specifically, I have no problem talking about my dad is the whitest man you'll ever meet in the world, but he married this little Cree woman and he moved to the reserve. And so without my parents getting together, I don't know what my mom saw in him, but I'm happy that she saw something, or else me and my siblings wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
But the reality is that growing up, fortunately, on the reserve, in Waterhen Lake First Nation, I had access to culture. I had access to language. I had access to ceremony. But when you're a young kid and you want to play sports, you want to get involved in a lot of other things, I almost took it for that cultural piece as for granted. And so I didn't, for most of my teenage years, all of my teenage years growing up, and it wasn't until university that I didn't even feel, I kind of bought into the stereotypes, right? It becomes that self-fulfilling prophecy, the lazy Indian and this and that, and you don't feel like you belong. You don't feel like you have a place in this world. You don't even feel like you belong in university because historically you weren't allowed to do any of those kinds of things, right? And so I didn't have pride in being First Nations. I didn't have that cultural pride. I kept my head down, and I always, I tried. Obviously, I didn't fully believe all of the negative narratives that were out there, but it took time. I connected with, and I really attribute a lot to this former traditional advisor there, the late Glenn Anaquat Gakietit. He reintroduced me to that culture and told me it was okay to learn about these things, and really left it open for me to decide if I'm going to go all in or if I'm going to, and there was no gatekeeping. There was no, you have to do it this way, or if you do it wrong, or you can't do this. There was no shame or blame tied to it. It was an open environment where it was just an opportunity to learn. And from those, after I got some of those more cultural teachings on learning how to put up a teepee or helping out at different ceremonies, I started to hold my head up a little higher. I started feeling automatically being more confident in who I was, and being proud to be First Nations, being proud to be from my community, being proud and understanding that we have a rich culture and a rich history and a beautiful culture. And that being shared is so important. It's a huge part of who we are and who our identity is. And then talking about Mosaic, because I know we're getting close to wrapping up for time here, but it's a really cool experience. It's a good introduction to what that culture is, but then it's taking it a step further and understanding that it's not just the food and the dance, that there's more to it to that. Learn about their history as well. Learn about their customs, their traditions. Do that research so you come in there prepared, so you're not coming in with a negative stereotype, or you're coming in with preconceived ideas on what it's going to be like. And you'll start to realize that there's a lot of similarities amongst many cultures, whether it be for respect, or even how we eat, how some of our practices, how we treat our elders, how we treat our how do we talk to our kids, whatever that looks like, you find similarities. And I think that's where we can help connect and break down those barriers, right? I think there's sometimes a real fear of, I don't want to offend you. I don't want to do this. I don't want to offend. It's okay to ask. And I think that sometimes is, don't be afraid to ask. And if people know that you're genuine, 99.9% of the time, they'll be willing to help you out or teach you in a good way. So, yeah.
Perfect. I think we're going to have to wrap things up here right away. This has been an awesome talk. This is actually, I told Nick when we started this that our podcasts are usually about 25 to 35 minutes, but I said, let's just let this one go until it's comfortable. I'm not going to stop it early. So we're actually at about 59 minutes just hit on my clock right now. So I think this has been a great chat. It's our longest podcast, but I there's nothing here that I would want to cut out. So Thanks a lot for chatting with me today. I just wanted to end really quickly, again, by bringing it back to our the Truth and Reconciliation Fund here at SSCF. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Nick is on the committee. We have, I believe, at the time of the recording, there's 6 members on our committee. If you go to that sscf.ca/reconciliation, you can get all the information. You'll see the list of committee members. One of the main things for us is we give funding back to the community as a community foundation. When it came to this Truth and Reconciliation Fund, we knew that we needed to have an Indigenous lens, an Indigenous leadership to give that back. So we've been really lucky to have some amazing Indigenous leaders, including Nick, on our committee, who are making those decisions, who understand the importance of education, the importance of culture and language, and what that context really means, who are all leading that committee and making the decisions. So if you're a donor, if you're looking to make to bring more funding towards Indigenous communities and you're not sure where to go, if you come to SSCF and you're giving to this fund, I'm confident in saying that we have the right people making those decisions who truly understand where that money should go and how it's going to make the biggest impact. And I just want to say again, I really appreciate your involvement with SSCF. I know in the past, when you're at the chamber, you did do some workshops, at least one workshop with our board. Coming onto this committee has been huge for us, and lending your voice to this podcast is really invaluable, I think, for having something for people to hear from.
Victor, you made my head so big. Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. And like I said, I'm one voice. My opinion is mine. It's from my perspective, and knowing that there's different opinions for other Indigenous people, but ultimately I appreciate it, and I commend the steps the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation has taken to kind of do this in the right way, and understanding that it's going to take some time and patience, and but that's how things are done. If you want to do them right, you do have to take the time. You have to invest that time, and I'm definitely appreciative of that. So thank you, Victor, for the work that you're doing, the work that you and your team and your board is doing. And I appreciate you inviting us in and having that Indigenous perspective. But not only not my voice, because there's plenty of matriarchs around that table as well that have a lot of good knowledge that they're willing to share. So
absolutely. All right. Thanks a lot, Nick.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to learn more, visit South Saskatchewan Community Foundation at sscf.ca or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. And of course, make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're tuning in from.